Good morning to you. 12 minutes past 8 is the time. You tune into the Eddie Damon Breakfast Show here on BBC Radio Leicester. Now, next we've got some really powerful radio to play you. It's a genetic condition that you might never have heard of, but it's actually the most common inherited cause of learning disabilities. Earlier on, we spoke to the brilliant Alex and Chris McQuaid from Groovy, whose boys suffer from a genetic condition called Fragile X.
OK, so we've got Evan, he's now 10 years old, and we've got Xander, he's 7. And first of all, I want to say that they're both fantastic characters. They have the best personalities, but they do have a number of struggles having Fragile X syndrome, the full mutation. So for them, it's an intellectual disability. They have problems with attention, speech and language, communication, and there can be behavioural problems as well. So day-to-day life for us can be very challenging, but it also can fill us with a lot of joy as well.
Loads of joy as well. Great, lads. Now, Chris, tell me about that moment that you realised that something perhaps needed just looking at, something perhaps wasn't quite right.
Okay, so it was from the start, really, of birth. You know, we're healthy, young, no sorts of hints of any kind of conditions or anything else in our history. So we had a child, as everybody does. Immediately, Evan started to show global developmental delays, and so what that means is things like Alex would go to mum and baby classes, and Evan would just be slightly different. He'd be behind with his gross motor skills, fine motor skills. He started to stim, which is like a flap, quite early on, or rocking can often be signs, those sorts of things. And so we started to talk to medical professionals. You go to your GP, you talk to the health visitors, those kinds of people, saying that everybody catches up by 7. Everyone's different till then. But in the background, we knew something was happening, and particularly, and the thing we always say to medical professionals is listen to mum. Mum knows best. And that's what we're focusing on is what Alex was feeling and Alex was understanding. And so we started to talk to professionals. But because Fragile X isn't well known, it isn't trained within the NHS particularly brilliantly, and as lots of intellectual disabilities are, we don't look at them as a holistic care pathway. And so training is low, awareness is low, and these things are thought of as rare conditions. But actually, you mentioned the stats from Pete earlier on, but it's carried by 1 in 250 women and 1 in 600 men. So it's not that rare. We just need to make sure we're talking about it.
So Alex, take me about, as Chris was saying there, mum knows best. Mum always knows best. You know something's not quite right, and you need some help with this. You want to know what's going on. When you're told about the fact of Fragile X and about that diagnosis, how was that as a family unit as well?
Oh, it was hugely heartbreaking. And I've heard so many Fragile X families say that when you get that diagnosis, you go through a grieving state. You're grieving for the children that you thought you had. I mean, in our case, it was 2 children that were being diagnosed. And in fact, that's probably an area, again, that I think we're lacking in support. When you get a diagnosis like that, there is no support for the parents, and if you're not looking after yourself, it becomes very hard to look after the children as well. It was a bit of a blur. I think that process of acceptance took probably at least a year, and you feel every emotion, and it's okay to feel all those emotions.
Well, joining me now is Professor Julian Barwell, a professor in genetics and genome biology, DNA genetics at University of Leicester, and works for University Hospital Leicester as well. Professor Barwell, I feel like we've got genetics royalty on the show this morning. Says thank you so much for your time and for coming on the show. We've heard a little bit about Fragile X this morning, but could you perhaps explain to us exactly what it is and how this affects people as well?
Thanks so much, Adi. So you may remember the show Sesame Street when you were growing up, and it would say it was brought to you by the letter A, B, or C, and really Fragile X is brought to you by the letter A. So first of all, the people with Fragile X are more likely to have additional needs. They're more likely to have problems similar to autism. They may have anxiety or agitation, but also for some individuals, what they can end up with ADHD type problems. And it can be very similar to autism, but they might be a little bit more sociable than some other types of people with autism. But a lot of people present in slightly different ways. Now, the key is to be able to start by asking if they've got these types of problems along with the additional needs, but then to take a family history. And what we're looking for is anybody else in the family, particularly on the mother's side of the family, because this is what it's called Fragile X because of a change on the X chromosome. And you get 2 copies of all of your chromosomes. You get a copy from mum and dad, and boys get the Y chromosome from dad, and they get the X chromosome from mum. And women have got 2 X chromosomes. So you're looking for that change on the X chromosome. So it tends to be carried down the mother's line. So what you're looking for are other people in the family who have had similar problems down the mother's line, like the uncle or maybe a cousin, but also carriers. The mothers, for instance, sometimes go through an early menopause, and even the grandparents, if they carry it, they may be misdiagnosed with Parkinson's because they have another problem beginning with A, and it's called ataxia. So taking the family history is so important. So it's important for families who are worried about Fragile X to go and talk to their doctor and say, I've got this family history. But it's also important for us to talk to healthcare professionals about that as well.
So, Professor Barwell, is there enough testing that's being done for Fragile X? It seems like there's very little.
We need to do more. Early diagnosis is key, and that's for 2 reasons. Firstly, to give families choice so they know if they've got a child with Fragile X, that they can be aware that there's a risk of further children being born. But also, the thing about the Fragile X gene, it's about the connections that the nerves make within the brain. It's something called neuroplasticity. It's how those connections and how those memories are made. And we're aware from neurobiology that the key is to be able to make as many connections by the age of 5. We always say the most important part of your education is up to the age of 5, because that's when all of these key connections in your brain are made. And so if we can make the diagnosis earlier, then we're more likely to be able to introduce better connections through the allied health professionals, so important, the psychology, the occupational therapy, speech and language, physiotherapy, but also be able to think about new medication. In the future, we're hopeful that there will be new drugs which will improve the IQ, the cognition, to help these children become more independent, which is obviously what we're hoping for in the longer term. But also there's some fascinating research in gene therapy as well. But early diagnosis is key, and therefore you're 100% right. Awareness is part of that, and getting the testing program more accessible for people in the longer term.
And Julian, how important is it for Alex and Chris both came on today, and they were so open, they were so honest about their story, to raise awareness, to talk about it as well. How important is that?
It's 100% the way forward. We are working with Chris and Alex. We've been running conferences with the support of Leicester Hospital Charities, but we've also been working with them to think about developing new trials with the university and Research Base, which is our clinical research facility here. We've been the highest recruiter in Europe to a cannabinoid-based gel study as well, and also speaking to the wider community, be it stakeholders, like, for instance, we've got a relationship with Relate, Leicester Relate, because we know that the impact on relationships can be so huge, not just between couples, but also the family dynamic and the other siblings as well. So working with Chris and Alex is a true partnership. It's a true partnership. I'm very privileged to be able to work with them. I always say their disease, my career, but both of our lives. And it's a real honour to work with people like them.
Professor Barwell, thank you so much for your time this morning and for coming on the show. The brilliant Professor Julian Barwell, a professor in genetics and genome biology as well, joining us this morning here on BBC Radio Leicester. They do amazing work at the University Hospitals of Leicester. I know that I'm a carrier of a rare genetic condition as well, and perhaps in time I'll tell you more about that as well, and perhaps we could get Professor Barwell back on to talk about that further and about rare genetic conditions as well.